Music theory, history of the major scale formula, noting that our primary objective will be a practical one, taking the mindset of an engineer or possibly a bookkeeper trying to put an engine or set of books together today, looking to the past, hoping to glean some information about the process that would help us put the thing together today. That does not mean, however, that we're just going to accept dogmatically the series of steps taken in the past to put the thing together. It does mean that if we make any changes to that series of steps, we have to make the argument. In other words, like in a court of law, saying you're innocent until proven guilty, similarly here, the process is the best process. It worked unless proven otherwise. You have to have a preponderance of evidence showing why you would be doing something different. That's the perspective we'd like to take here. All right, the historical foundations and practical logic. Music theory is a product of both mathematical discovery and practical adoption. So to apply it effectively, it's useful to understand why it developed as it did. That is our objective. I'm going to use an analogy here. It's not going to be a perfect analogy, but it gets the idea, the mindset that we want in our mind. So we're the modern engineer over here. We're trying to put together an engine. Let's imagine we're thinking back to the Model T or something like that to see how that was put together so that we can get an idea of how to put together the modern engine. Let's imagine, and this is fiction, and this is a fictional story to get the idea or mindset, that as the Model T was being put together, it was put together in an order that was defined in part by the parts that were available. And the parts were being shipped in from wherever they're being shipped in. We're imagining like China or something like that, right? So you're imagining that they're putting the engine together not in the most efficient process possibly, but as the parts are arising. So if we're over here and we're saying, hey, look, I got all the parts on the table. I don't really, is there a different order that I might put the engine together in now that I have all the parts on the table, or should I dogmatically just take the same series of steps that happened when they put the Model T together in my fictional story on how it was put together, right? And I think most people would say, hey, look, I'm trying to get the engine together as efficiently as I can to understand it as best I can. I can make a solid argument as to why, if I already have the parts on the table, I should do it in a different order. I should line it up differently. I'm going to put it together in a different order. That's a kind of similarity to the argument that we're going to be making on a historical basis. I accept that the Model T engine worked. I accept that it was a genius invention, but I'm not going to dogmatically follow the same steps if there's a rational reason not to do so, unless I'm putting something together that's a historical thing rather than an innovation or something that's functional. All right, and music does have a function, right? I need to learn it. I need to understand it so that I can then create it. And the functional practice then is to understand the elements so that I can then play with it and create it. Now you can see this most clearly in our most revered instrument, that being the piano. The piano is, so I'm gonna say some things about the piano that could upset people, but I want to lay down the foundation here and just say, obviously the piano is the baseline instrument. It's the keyboard that's going to be used even in today in modern technologies and DOSes and whatnot, when you put things in electronically. And that's because, in part, you have one key that you can play in, and then you can transpose that key. And of course, you can play with two hands, which means you can play the melody and you can play something else, chords at the same time. So functionally, great instrument. But you can kind of see historically, and we'll get into this more after we look at the historical building, that it was put together kind of like how the pieces came in our analogy, meaning how the historical pieces were gleaned, how the knowledges came up, kind of dictates how the piano looks like it was built. In other words, we came up with the 7 notes first and then kind of crammed in the 12 notes. Why did it happen that way? And once we come up to why did it happen that way, I will come back to the question of, would you redesign the piano if you had all the parts on the table? I think there's a strong argument for no, even from a functional basis. But you could imagine different structures of the piano. I know that's kind of sacrilege to say here, but I'm just saying, just for a thought experiment, We'll put that on. We'll come back to it. Let's go through the history, and then we'll come back to that idea at the end. All right, so we have to go back to good old Pythagoras and the birth of the musical ratios. Now, Pythagoras didn't have a lute, I don't believe. He was playing like with one string to try to figure out the ratios and whatnot. But this is just a picture from AI to get us an idea. He's an ancient Greek guy. So Pythagoras and his school, circa 500 BC, that sounds for before Christ, around here at least. That's what we call it, before Christ. They discovered the simple string length ratios created harmonies and sound. So he's the one that did some experiments. And of course, the Greek guys, so this is 500 BC, right? That's way back there. And you can think of the ideas of like Plato in his cave and whatnot, gave us a lot of the ideas that we still kind of grapple with today. And one of those ideas is that there's certain things that are going to be more real than most of the things that we actually see physically, such as the envisionment of a triangle is more real in some ways than an actual written triangle, because a written triangle is not perfect, right? It's drawn imperfectly, even if drawn by a computer, whereas the concept of the triangle is more real. And you can see if you apply that school of thought out, you can imagine, well, then things like formulas become more real. Math becomes something that describes reality in a more precise way than the imprecise way that we actually see math being portrayed in reality. And music, he's going to see kind of as ratios, as a form of kind of math, right? So he figured out that the octave has a 2-1, the perfect fifth has a 3-2, and the perfect fourth has a 4-3. So how did he do this? You can imagine one string that he was plucking and said, well, what if I made half the string? What if I made a fourth of the string, and so on and so forth? And he was doing these experiments, and he came out with these ratios, which at the time, as far as I can tell, was quite profound to them. So the school of Pythagoras became, a very important, thought tank, I guess, is a way that you can think of it. And they revered, numbers, and they revered music because of its number quality. I point this out too because I think that these days we've kind of lost that to some degree. We think of it as so aesthetic that saying that it has to do with math is almost an insult to it, which is totally opposite to obviously the creation of it, where Pythagoras was like, it is math. It's math in ears. It's math in like math alive. That's why the whole school was like, this is the fun. Music is the fundamental thing. Why? Because it is math, right? That's why. So that's why the Greek people, I think, were saying, look, kids should be learning music from the grade school, like as kids, because it's ratios, because it's math, because it's basically the underpinnings of reality. And these days, I think we kind of lost that, in part possibly because we lost the numbers. So most people don't really know what the number system mean. We use letters, which kind of takes us, which is fine, but it takes us like a step removed from the real idea that you kind of could grasp from it, which is the ratios. In any case, these intervals were derived by dividing a vibrating string and observing the pitch production. So their theory, harmony is math. Beautiful intervals come from simple ratios. So you can see what happened. He didn't have 12 equal notes within an octave. He had one string, plucking it and saying, oh my goodness, this is cool because these ratios come up to the musical harmonies that are pleasing to our ears, have these beautiful ratios that are working out, which fits perfectly into my Platonic idea of math being, the real underpinning of reality, right? Now, as we go in our story, we also have to just deal with the idea of this. Is it cultural? Is music completely cultural, or is it completely scientific as we deconstruct the engine here? And of course, it's a mix between the two of them. There are, of course, cultural components, but there's going to be some things that you would think all cultures would kind of unify in because there's a scientific underpinning. We talked a little bit about that last time in a harmonic series we've discussed before, which we'll touch on here. And you can see that if any culture started to pluck a string, they're probably going to find the same pitches that are going to be pleasing to the ear. So the idea for Pythagoras is that's a human thing. That's what all cultures you would think they would come to to some degree, although there could be variations in different cultures, which we'll talk more a little bit about later. Just want to touch on that idea here. Also note that he discovered that the octave is the range that you can work in. So you can't really, no culture is going to come up with different pitches through the octaves. Why? Because that would mean that men and women couldn't sing together because they typically have different pitches in their voices. So if you do not have symmetry past the octave, then it would be a horrible thing for most cultures, because then men and women couldn't sing together, you would think. So once again, just the way it works, you would think would mean that there are certain boundaries that a culture would have to pick from. One would be you're going to pick a series of pitches that are between an octave and that are going to repeat. And then the question, and then you would think some would be tied out to the harmonic series, which would have some similarities, and then you have a range of differences within that range to pick pitches that you might choose culturally, right? That would be my general simplified, explanation of that. So stacking fifths to build a scale, the circle of fifths. So I'm not going to give it in a circle here. You can look up the circle of fifths. We might look at it later, but I find that a lot of people don't actually know what a fifth is in half steps. And I'm going to talk about half steps now, even though Pythagoras didn't know about half steps, right? He was looking at ratios. He was doing the math. He didn't have 12 notes. But I'm going to show it to you with the 12 notes that we currently have that we talked about, which we'll get into in a second. So repeating the process of stacking perfect fifths. So he's looking at ratio-wise. He's stacking perfect fifths, which you can think of in a 12-note system that you take every 7 notes. So you count up 7 notes, and you're going to say, hey, look, there's only 12 notes in the musical alphabet. What if I keep counting up? Well, you're going to go past the octave. But that's okay if you go past the octave. It's going to repeat in our current system. So the pitches are going to repeat. So I'll show you that in a second. So he came up with the series of C, G, D, B, E, B, and F sharp. Now, if you rearrange these, you can see that these are our natural notes except the F sharp. Now, why did that happen? Well, notice when he does this, it doesn't come out perfect. The math doesn't come out perfect. So I don't want to get into this in detail, but you can basically see what happened later is we cut the thing up into 12 equal units between the octaves, and we're like, that last one doesn't work quite right. And so we're going to round it. We're going to fudge it. We're going to make it work. We're going to put the plug in from a bookkeeping standpoint, right? And then there's a bunch of history on how they did that and what kind of tweaks they made to basically make that last bit work, to make it evenly work throughout the system so you have equal spacing. But I don't want to get into that now. I just want to get the general idea. Collapsing these notes into single octave range gave rise to 7-note system. So these are the notes from the diatonic scale. So he did it mathematically, but let's imagine that we know the 12 notes. He didn't know the 12 notes. He's doing this with one string, right? But let's imagine we have the 12 notes and we've divided them out. How would we do this? Well, if I was on the C, I'd take a perfect fifth, which is 7 notes up. So we're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I would get to a G, and then I'm going to go 7 notes up from there, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've passed the octave. Here's the C. I've passed the octave. That's okay. I'm not going to worry about that. And then I'm going to keep on going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to keep going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And one more time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Or one more time. Here's where the fudge happens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 gets me to an F sharp. We want it to be an F. It doesn't work out perfectly. There's a rounding difference, but it's pretty nice. So then if we take all of these notes and that spans through multiple octaves, you can see we went through C to C, another octave, and so on. So we went through multiple octaves, but if we squish them all into one octave and put it in order, then you get our 7 notes. So you take these are the notes, you put them in order: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and of course, again, the F sharp is the funny one that they're gonna tinker with or whatever later once we do the 12 notes. So you can see that's the general. So that means that they had the 7-note, we can say collection of notes, or you can say scale if you play them upwise, pitchwise. That would be the scale. So they had the scale, before they had the 12 notes, because he's doing it in ratios. So here's a more accurate possibly picture with one string that he's using, and then he's using half the string, a fourth of the string, and he's figuring out his ratios, right? So why 7 notes? So the practical foundation of the scale, so the Pythagorean system yielded a coherent, usable set. So you can imagine he's tinkering with this thing. You know, this is how I imagine it, at least. He's tinkering with it, and then he's made this discovery. He's like, oh my goodness, if I stack the fifths, I come up with and then I scrunch all the numbers into one scale, it comes up with this cool set of 7 notes that all sound harmonically good together. Now, why do they sound harmonically good? He would say because they're perfect ratios. And that's how the universe is, man. That's like the more reality than like what we see and stuff. But obviously scientifically later, what are they going to say? Well, that's because whenever we hear something, there's always this harmonic series, and these things line up to some degree with the harmonic series. So scientifically, you can make the same kind of argument. And he would say, well, of course, scientifically that works because that's the way the gods, he had gods at the time, so we would say one God, that's the way God created things. That's of course, that's why the science worked, right? So chicken, the egg, what's the explanation? Okay, I don't know, but that's the idea. So those notes avoid harsh dissonance and provide enough variety for melody. So the diatonic system became the foundation of Western music because it works well with voices and simple instruments. So now you got a set of 7 notes that people can sing with, and people can play different instruments. But it's somewhat limited because we're talking about just 7 notes. We haven't really got to other pitches, right? So we're just using these 7 notes. And so we'd like to have more colors in the crayon box if I could, because I'm getting bored. I want to make more colorful, like this thing. I want to make more colorful stuff. So the harmonic series, nature's blueprint for the musical notes. So when a string of air column, so let's just think scientifically now. So let's say later we got the hertz. Now we can measure the wavelength in hertz. So now we're going, oh, wait a sec. I can actually measure precisely scientifically the wavelength. So that's going to lead me to say, well, I would like to then see the harmonic series when you pluck the string, which we talked about before. What are the resonances that aren't just the main pitch, but the other pitches to it? And that's going to help give us a scientific reason as to why the 7 notes that were picked make sense, and why many cultures will pick similar notes, right? So when a string of air column vibrates, it doesn't just vibrate at one frequency, it creates harmonics. So this is what we talked about before, similar to dropping a pedal in a pond. It doesn't make just one wave, it makes multiple waves, one fundamental and then multiple other waves. Similarly, air compresses against each other, but it's easier to envision a wave, right? It's a compression wave, okay. But so fundamental, it has these fundamental series. So the first 7, 8 overtones closely resemble the structure of the major scale. So now you can say, so now instead of saying, well, Pythagoras is thinking like a religious person over there in a Pythagorean religious school, and he wants it to be like from gods or whatever that came up with the underpinning. But now we're going to say scientifically that the reason it happens is because you have these harmonic series. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with the way Pythagoras was seeing it. This doesn't disprove the way he was seeing it, right? It actually proves that the way he was seeing it was right, although there would be arguments between the scientists and the philosophers in terms of what's the rationale, what's the actual underpinning thing that gives us the phenomenon that we've come to from 2 different directions, you know? But so this is not man-made, it's physical. Musical notes arise from natural resonances. So this would, once again, you would think, give us some restrictions from culture to culture. So notice other cultures might pick different notes, but they can't pick different notes that are going to be different past the octave. Otherwise, men and women couldn't sing together. No culture would do that, you would think. And you would think certain pitches, like the perfect fifth, for example, is pretty rock steady. That's as comfortable a sound that you can get. So you would think that no culture would really throw that one out, you would think, you know. So that gives you some restriction to say music isn't totally cultural, although clearly it has a cultural component in terms of the scales created. So the move to 12 notes equal temperament. So now we're saying later on, we're saying, hey, look, these 7 notes are great, but now that we can measure hertz, now that I can break the interval between the octave up into a series of measurable distances, wouldn't it be cool if I have units like a ruler? I want to make equal unit distance between the two. That would make sense. That's what we would want to do. So now as music evolved, instruments needed to play in any key. The exact ratios weren't flexible. In other words, 7 notes isn't enough. I want to be able to switch keys and play in different keys. I want more crayons in the crayon box. So Western music adopted the 12-tone equal temperament system. So the octave is divided into 12 equal parts, semitones, and each note is the same distance from the next. So now we're saying, okay, now I can measure this thing. So now I'm going to break it out. I'm going to break it out by measuring the actual hertzes, right, into 12 equal units like a ruler. So now we have 12 equal units. Now, why did they use 12? They didn't have to, because you could imagine that you could put a system together that maybe was 24 or something might work or something like that. That's where the variance comes in. So now the question, so from culture to culture, you would think we're restricted by the octaves. We're restricted that the number of pitches that we pick need to have some resonance with the harmonic series scientifically. You would think they would have a perfect fifth, for example, would have to be in there because it's such a fundamental sound just to all human beings. And but then you could have some variance in terms of how many pitches you're going to basically work with, right? We had 7, and now we're going to have 12 pitches, but you could imagine 24. That would be a lot more colors in the crayon box, but it's too many colors. You're going to start getting overwhelmed. So it seemed that 12 worked well. Now you could argue that maybe there was some Western cultural thing that 12 came up because 12 comes up. There's 12 apostles. There's 12 blah, blah, 12 eggs in a carton, 12 donuts or whatever. Maybe 12 they thought was numerically so maybe there was a cultural influence there. I don't know, but it seems like 12 works quite well functionally as well. So this system trades mathematical purity for practical usability. Why does it trade mathematical purity? Because we're not talking in cosmic ratios anymore, although it does have mathematical beauty in that we're breaking the octave into 12 units. The problem is it's not exactly even in the 12 units as we saw, right? We had to fudge it a little, you had to fudging it a little bit to make it work. And then there's a whole history on how they fudged it to make the equal units sound equal so it works right within that system. Okay, I won't get in that. Deriving 7 from 12, so building a scale with consistent spacing. So now you've got the major scale selects 7 out of 12 equal spaced notes. So now we've got all the parts on the table using our analogy. Now I can measure in hertz, I can use the ratios, I've got 12 notes, I've got my instrument, I've got my rulers properly set up that has equal spacing to it. Am I going to go back now and build my instrument, build my engine using the same historical process that was used as the information was brought, not by boat, but by history, by discovery? No, I don't think I am, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, now I can make a rational argument to say, look, if we should use a 12-note system because that just makes sense, and it's beautiful that you could now take 7 notes from the 12 notes, deriving the scale from the 12 notes. So I'm no longer going to build the 7 notes first just because that's the thing that was shipped over to us first, and that's all I had to work with. Right now I have everything to work with. No, I'm gonna take the 12 units first, and then derive from it the 7 units. You see? Okay, so the pattern whole half is what we derive. So now instead of us basically using the ratios to come up with the 7 notes, we're going to take the 12 notes and say, look, we can just apply the pattern to the 12 notes to derive the scale that they came up with historically with this ratio analysis. That's the origin of this formula. It's perfect fifths stacked on top of each other, and then taking all those notes and cramming them together, which now, instead of doing that, we're going to take the 12 notes and then simply apply the formula, right, to derive it. So again, so that means functionally, that's how you want to do it. You want to start with the 12 notes and then apply the formula. So the spacing provides melodic motion without crowding notes too closely. So intuitively, this makes sense as well, because you would expect if you break the octave into 12 units, that you would then take every other unit would give you a nice stepping sound upwards. That makes sense, although you would want some variation, and having 2 half steps, which one here and one when you go back to the root, gives you at least some variation so it's not too static. So just from an aesthetic standpoint, it looks like a great series as well. It's not too many. 24 would be a lot of notes. 12 seems right. We can derive the 7-note scales that was historically what was derived from them perfectly, or not perfectly, but well enough. And so that looks good. So the stepwise motion with tension and resolution. So the use of half steps, 2 in the scale, adds variation, meaning there's 2 half steps. So usually we have whole steps and then 2 half steps. All right, functional versus historical perspective, a balanced view. So historically then, if we go back to our analogy, what happened historically? Then it's just like shipping in the parts to build the engine. They first came up with the shipment of, oh my goodness, I figured out that I can break the string up and I can come up with these ratios. So then they use that, oh my goodness, I can stack the perfect fifths, leading to the 7-note scale before we can break out the octave into equal units, because we didn't have measurements to do it, such as measuring in hertz, for example. But functionally, we now see the 7 notes as selection from the 12. But, so see what I mean? So we're going to say, I believe that although it was done in this order historically, if I was to make the argument in a court of law, innocent till proven guilty, I can make the case that a rational set of juries would say that it would make sense to learn it, not starting with the 7 notes, but starting with the 12 notes, because I already have that information. It's on the table now. I don't want to repeat it historically, dogmatically, just because that's the way it happened throughout history. I want to learn it the way that functionally is easiest to make the engine to learn it fastest so I can do stuff with it. So understanding both perspectives allows musicians to adopt and innovate, build new modes and tuning systems, break rules with purpose. So notice that some people take this concept too far, and I want to point this out as well, because this is where the relativists come in, and they throw out the whole court concept theory altogether. And the theory is innocent until proven guilty. You accept the wisdom of history until you can build a preponderance of evidence to prove that something should be done differently. The people that are cultural relativists want to say, no, it's all equal. There is no hierarchy of basically how we should be treating the weight of an argument. Obviously, if an argument has been made throughout history and has been used, that's the argument that has weight to it. That's the one that you have to have a preponderance of evidence greater than in order to beat it. It's not like it's equal. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to say this random thing and you can't prove it's wrong. You have to come over here and prove it's wrong, right? It's like, no, I don't need to go over there and prove it's wrong, because you are the one that has the responsibility to make the argument that it's right, because you're saying something different than what has historically happened. They're not equal, right? You accept the historic thing is the thing that we accept until you make an argument to propose why something should be different. Otherwise, you can just go over here and yell all you want, and if you're not going to make that argument, then what are you doing? The likelihood that you're correct is like ridiculously low. It's nonsense, right? Anyway. So why this matters for practical application: making informed musical choices. Knowing the origins of music theory helps us avoid blind rule following. So again, we don't want to just follow the rules dogmatically. We want to see why things were built and then systematically make arguments on how we can improve things. That's how we get better. Understand why the pattern feels right. So, and we can see that historically, ratio-wise. We can also see it with the harmonic series. We can also intuitively kind of see that that pattern makes sense in terms of the stepping and scale situation. So make better decisions when composing, improvising, and arranging. Music isn't arbitrary. It's built on acoustic, perceptual, and historical truths. So is there a cultural component to music? Yes. Is there variation on how much you can do within music? Yes. Will any culture just willy-nilly choose any set of notes and all notes are the same and everything is relative and it wouldn't matter? No, that's ridiculous. Why? Because there's a limit of the octave, because no culture would want men and women not to be able to sing together, and because the perfect fifth, it lines up, is really core and fundamental, because the harmonic series is a human thing, not a cultural thing. It's not all culturally relative, okay? So let's go back to our piano thing. So knowing this then, you can see that the piano was basically built kind of historically, right? Because you can see that the white notes are, in essence, the 7 notes. Now, they tweaked it over time, right? Because it wasn't perfect. They had to do the math, and then they retuned the piano to get an even spacing and so on. But it's basically tuned to the key of C on the white notes. And then if you play in a different key, then you're going to use the black notes. Now, notice functionally that works great depending on what you're doing. Because notice that even if you're doing like computer stuff, and even if you don't know how to play the piano, they still use the keyboard. Why? Because you can play any melody or tune in the key of C and simply transpose it to another key. So that means if I want to play something diatonically, I can play it in the key of C, or you can imagine changing the piano so that basically all the white keys become any note, any like the key of C, the key of D, the key of E, and then the black keys follow in the same pattern. That would be kind of nice, right? Because then you can actually play just the white keys and every key would sound good because they're all within the diatonic scale, whether it be in the key of C or any other key. But the general idea is you can play the melody or anything in the key of C, and then you can transpose it to any other key because all the other keys are parallel. So you can transpose every note parallel with a computer or something like that. And of course, the piano means that you can play the melody with one hand and you can play the chords with the other hand. So that's great. But you could ask the question, like, what would be the pros and cons if you re-engineered the piano? If you had all the parts on the table, would you create it the same way? Let's say that if you took our system and you say, I have the 12 notes first before the 7, wouldn't that lead you to say, look, maybe I should make the piano keys all the same distance, 12 note distances, and not have any different sized keys? What would be the pros and cons of that? The bad side of that would be that if I don't know how to play the piano, I can still, under this system, play a piano that's still in key because all the notes are in the diatonic key. Whereas if they were all the same notes, then I'd have to know the formula. I'd have to know the formula to play in any particular key. That would be bad. That would be the downside. But the plus side might be that all the shapes would be the same, similar to the guitar. You would have an instrument that would be uniform all the way across. Why would that matter? Because that means that if I learn, then I would only have one shape, just like on the guitar. I'd have to learn one master shape for the formula being applied. And remember what happens here. We've got 12 notes, right? 12 notes, and we have 7, and we take 7 of those to get our collection of notes. That means that we have 12 different collection of notes that we can be playing. And then within those collection of notes, we can choose any starting point, which gives us our 7 modes. So you end up with 12 times 7 scales that you can imagine you have to learn. But obviously you don't really have to learn that many scales. You have to, because there's the pattern repeats. Now in this system, the current system, notice the pattern doesn't exactly repeat. So when I move from the key of C to playing something in the key of D, major to major, let's say, then the pattern's not the same. So I actually have to remember 12 different patterns this way. That's the downside of the current layout of the piano. Whereas if they were all equally spaced, then you can learn one master pattern and it would move, all the shapes would be the same, just like on the guitar. So there's now another bad side of that, just to flush this out a little bit more. I'm not saying we should do this. I'm just saying one thing is that these keys are also really great because they allow us to stretch our fingers further. Meaning, like I wouldn't be able to reach as far if I had all the keys were the same distance, the same width. So that might be a problem. Maybe that's a reason why you wouldn't want a layout like that. But you can also imagine, well, is this the proper way that we should put the keys, the black keys in there? I mean, as though they're in the key of C, maybe. You can imagine, maybe you just take every other note and you make it a black key or something like that. I'm just throwing something out there. I don't know. Why would that be? Because then, although the instrument wouldn't be completely symmetrical, it would be more symmetrical. So in that case, instead of learning 12 different patterns as you learn all the keys on the piano, you might be able to break it down to 2 patterns, that you'd have to learn, and you'd still have the benefit of having the keys kind of out of the way so that you can have shorter hand distances when you're playing different things. So I'm not saying we should change the piano or anything. I'm just saying, the design of it does have, just like we've seen, it has functionality in it, and it does have some history in it, and you can kind of see how it was built, within the piano, because it does look like it was built kind of how the thing came up historically, with basically 7 notes being the primary 7 notes, C being the primary key that we play in, and then the 12 other notes. That's why they're natural notes and stuff. But today you would think, I kind of like thinking that all the notes are the same, and that the key of C is just one of 12, and that doesn't really have any, mathematically, it doesn't seem like it have any benefit to it. So you can imagine a different layout. Again, I'm not saying we should do that. I'm just saying you can imagine functionally that you can imagine different layouts. Okay, but I still say the piano, one of the reasons the piano is great is because it's in one key on all the white keys, because then someone that doesn't know how to play the piano can just, like when I was a kid, I would just go on the piano when my parents were gone, and don't make fun of me or nothing, because I don't know what I'm doing, and I could tap on the piano and just make a melody or like a rhythm that sounds good, even though I have no idea. I don't know anything, right? I'm just tapping on the piano. That's pretty cool to be able to do. But again, I can't really transpose it as easily as I would be able to do once I learned the system, if it was laid out differently. But again, electronically, you can use this same system and then transpose it. So you can just use the white keys and play diatonically and then transpose it. So it's got some pros and cons. Anyways, beautiful instrument.